honey-coloured houses, beautiful cottages, sheep grazing on the uplands, and villages hiding in deeply wooded ravines. Castles, churches, stately homes, and prehistoric long barrows are scattered up and down the hills, whilst ancient highways and trout-filled rivers crisscross the region. This is the Cotswolds, officially an area of outstanding natural beauty in southwest England. Hi there, and welcome to the Cotswold Explorer. I'm Robin Shuckburgh, and over the last few years, accompanied by Ross, Widget and Gizmo, I've explored the area in considerable detail, telling the story of its enchanting history. In this film, we're revisiting 6 of the brightest stars that Cotswolds has to offer, to give them the attention they deserve. We start at the beautiful village of Broadway with its wonderful arts and crafts heritage, to perhaps the best example of a preserved Cotswold town, Chipping Campden. We'll journey down the Roman road called the Fosse Way to what many consider to be the jewel in the crown of the Cotswolds, the extremely popular Bourton on the Water. Then we drop down into the Windrush Valley to Burford, with its remarkable medieval high street, before continuing south for a tale of 2 villages in Bibury and the famous Arlington Row. Finally, at the very south of the region, we'll conclude our tour in Castle Combe, another Cotswold classic. Join us for the next couple of hours and escape to some of England's finest countryside. This is Cotswold Stars. We begin this film in the very northwest of the region, in the village of Broadway. Smaller than many of the other famous Cotswold towns, Broadway is on the northern tip of the region, actually just in the county of Worcestershire. But it's surrounded on 3 sides by the rather more familiar Cotswold county of Gloucestershire. You could easily be forgiven for assuming that it was named after its extraordinarily beautiful wide high street, lined with chestnut trees, golden medieval stone buildings, and a plethora of shops, cafes, hotels and pubs, which lead you down to the village green at the bottom. Broadway is well worth a visit for this street alone. However, you wouldn't be correct. The village of Broadway was in existence long before the high street was built. A couple of miles south of the current village centre, on the Snows Hill Road, is the old Broadway village church, dedicated to St. Eadburga. This church is based on the Norman church built here after the invasion, probably, considering its name, on the site of an even earlier Saxon church. It was certainly at the centre of the ancient village of Broadway, and it was only when the coaching routes needed a way up the steep escarpment of the Cotswolds to provide a route east to Oxford and London that the road up Fish Hill was built, and the present village began to develop at its base. Because of its position, you might easily miss St. Eadburga's, but it will be a pity to do so. Eadburga was the granddaughter of Alfred the Great, king of the West Saxons from 871 to 886. She seems to have been a saintly child, dedicated her life to good works, and was canonized shortly after her death. There's no sign of the early Saxon church now, and the current church dates, at least in part, from the 1100s. The Norman columns are a giveaway, wide and strong, and narrowing towards the top. There is some interesting medieval tiling in the south transept, and also on the plinth of the simple Norman tub font. There are some rather interesting relics which give you a slightly clearer idea of what life was like in what, as a child, I used to call the olden days. There is a wheeled bier for carrying a coffin to its grave, which was used here until the 1940s. Near the vestry is a very rare travelling pulpit, designed to be tied to a horse and taken wherever a preacher wanted to take the baptismal service. It will be unloaded and set up at his destination and packed up again for his return. The carved reredos and communion rail of 17th century, as is the chandelier, and there is a rare and wonderful royal arms to Charles I. It will come as little surprise to hear that very few of these have survived. This lovely church is very much worth a visit. There are, however, many other things for which Broadway is justly famous, and while we show you around, I know that you, along with the many artists, writers, musicians and craftsmen who discovered this place before you, will be totally captivated by its beauty. Filming, as we are, at 5 a.m. on a summer's day, you get a feeling for what it was that first attracted the group who became known as the Broadway Group to this pretty Worcestershire village. The rose-coloured buildings, mostly built with stone from the quarries on Broadway Hill to the south of us, give one an extraordinary sense of peace. The early morning sounds of the milkman making his deliveries, the delicatessen owner stacking his fresh produce onto ancient wooden market barrows and displaying them in front of his shop, and the wonderful, if tantalizing, smell from the baker's shop right in the middle of the village. This peaceful scene is probably as close as we will get to that which Francis Davis Millet, an expat American painter and illustrator, happened upon in the mid-1880s. It was perfect timing on Millet's part, for a fashion was developing in England for artists to gather in groups and form colonies away from the smelly, noisy and generally uninspiring life in the cities. They could be found in Cornwall, Yorkshire and Suffolk, as well as here in Broadway. Millet, a man blessed with some private wealth, first acquired Farnham House in Broadway to live in with his family. And shortly afterwards, when it became obvious that he would be joined by many of his creative friends, he bought an old monastic ruin called Abbott's Grange, which he restored just enough to turn it into a studio where they could all work. Into this idyllic environment came the painters, John Singer Sargent, Edwin Abbey, Alfred Parsons, also a well-known garden designer and illustrator, George Bourton, Edwin Blashfield, the English illustrator Fred Barnard, and the writers Henry James and Edmund Goss. J.M. Barrie also spent a good deal of time in Broadway when he rented, on a regular seasonal basis, the fantastic house at Stanway, just up the road. Goss wrote of the Grange at the time, "A medieval ruin, a small ecclesiastical edifice, which was very roughly repaired so as to make a kind of refuge for us. And there, in the morning, Henry James and I would write, while Abbey and Millet painted on the floor below, and Sargent and Parsons tilted their easels just outside. We were all within shouting distance, and not much serious work was done, for we were in towering spirits, and everything was food for laughter. Henry James was the only sedate one of all, benign, indulgent but grave, and not often unbending beyond a genial chuckle. It does seem Henry James was the only calming influence amongst this rather rowdy group, and it's not clear how much of an influence he really had. In the best tradition of artistic communities, they were a lively and colourful bunch, confident in the value of creative life and the contribution they would make to the rest of the world. They were certainly not great contributors to the peace and tranquillity of Broadway Village. Edmund Goss also wrote, "Nothing we do scandalizes the villagers. Fred Barnard, with an enormous stage slouch hat over his shoulders, chased one of the Americans down the street. The man chased, screaming all the time and trying to escape up lampposts and down wells. Not a villager smiled. Whatever we do or say, wear or sing, they only say, 'Them Americans is out again.'" Now fully restored, the Grange is an extremely upmarket B&B in which I haven't yet stayed, but they were extremely welcoming when we asked to film, and the breakfasts being laid out for their guests looked amazing. There's that tantalizing feeling again. Looking at their website, I would suggest that it's likely they are at the very top of their game. I did once own a 5-star B&B, so I know a little about how they should feel. Towards the end of the 19th century, this community, like all those before and after, started to wear out. It's an inevitability that such passion and enthusiasm will wilt with time, but the legacy of these young, rebellious and hugely creative people left behind is seen in the eyes of those thousands of people from all round the world who visit this village each year. The group dispersed. Abby bought a house in Fairford, south of here, and was followed by Sargent and eventually Henry James. Millet was later to die in the Titanic disaster in 1912, last seen ushering others onto the lifeboats with no apparent thoughts for his own safety. Halfway up the High Street, you will find the Ligon Arms. Originally a manor house, the Ligon Arms was first registered in 1532 and called the White Hart Inn. In the 1800s, it was renamed after Edward Ligon, a distinguished local landowner and soldier who commanded the 2nd Life Guards at the Battle of Waterloo. He was the 3rd son of the 1st Earl Beauchamp, and later became Colonel-in-Chief of the 13th Regiment of Light Dragoons. There are several pubs and inns round here named after him, so beware of confusion. In 1904, the hotel was taken over by one S.B. Russell, whose son Gordon became one of the country's greatest designers. Just a few doors down the street, there is a museum of Gordon's work. The hotel has a remarkable history. Charles I stayed here twice, and Oliver Cromwell is known to have slept here as well. It has passed through many hands, varying in their approach to the business. But for Mr. Russell, it was an exciting business to take on. His young son Gordon, however, had other plans. Gordon Russell was brought up in this village, and little did he know that he was going to become deeply associated with this village and one of the most famous furniture designers in the world. Behind me is his museum. Once again, the inspirational beauty of the village asserted its influence on an artistic mind. When his father took on the Ligon Arms in 1904, it is unlikely his son would have thought he was arriving in the village that would inspire him to huge success in his own field. He became, however, perhaps the most influential furniture designer of the 20th century. He fell under the influence of William Morris and the arts and crafts movement, who were often in and around Broadway at the time, particularly at Broadway Tower, which we will visit in a moment, and later was instrumental in the vital utility furniture programme after the Second World War, replacing the nation's destroyed possessions with affordable but elegant furniture. He also designed the famous chairs on which the congregation sit in the new Coventry Cathedral, built after the original building was totally destroyed in the war. Inside the Russell Museum, his likeness is immortalised in bronze by the late and renowned sculptor Alan Thornhill. The Lincoln Arms itself has recently been greatly restored by its current owners, and there is no doubt it offers accommodation and refreshment comfortably up to the standards of its historical reputation. At the western end of the village is a reconstructed railway station, which is currently the terminus of the Gloucestershire-Warwickshire Railway. It operates steam and heritage diesel trains between the Cheltenham Racecourse and Broadway, all along the base of the Cotswold Escarpment, through some of the most spectacular scenery in the region. I say currently the terminus because there are long-term plans to continue north. The two lovely drone pilots with whom I work were more than excited to film the steam trains chuffing their way through the countryside. Struggling up the escarpment to the south of the town, on a road called Fish Hill, it becomes clear why Broadway became a coaching stop for those travelling between Worcester and Oxford. The hill is extremely steep and would have required fresh horses to tackle it. Up at the top of the hill, turning right, we come across the Broadway Tower. William Morris used this place as a kind of holiday let. He brought his friends and his artist companions to stay here on a regular basis. It seems that the original idea for this tower was that of the great 18th century landscape architect, Capability Brown. His idea was brought to life by the 6th Earl of Coventry, who commissioned the architect James Wyatt, and it was completed in 1798. The tower has been inspirational for a variety of creative people. Thomas Phillips had his early printing press here. He was one of the greatest ever collectors of books and manuscripts. Many of the arts and crafts movement used the building as a place of refuge and meditation. The pre-Raphaelite artists Dante Gabriel Rossetti, Edward Burne-Jones and William Morris himself were frequent visitors, and it was here that Morris began his campaign for the preservation of historic monuments. Today it is closer to a museum than a residence, well worth a visit. And since we were last here, the owners of this extraordinary place have vastly improved the visitor experience, with a cafe and shop and a big parking space for which you do have to pay. Oh, and by the way, they are very unkeen on drones. We filmed extremely early in the morning in order not to disturb anyone, but we still had something of an angry reception. It has, however, one of the most extraordinary views in the country. It is said you can see 13 different counties from up here. I hope you've enjoyed this revisit to this beautiful village of Broadway. We've had a lovely time, it has to be said. We're now heading over the hills towards Chipping Campden, a breathtaking church and a wonderful village. We've been here before, some of you will know that, but when we last came it was drizzly and grey and miserable, and we don't feel we did it justice. The other thing, of course, is that our technology's got better. So we've come back to look at it again. This place is without question one of the most beautiful towns in the whole of the Cotswolds, possibly even the country. We're going to show you around. Come with me. The town of Chipping Campden, known by its locals, by the way, simply as Camden, is world famous. There are all kinds of good reasons why Camden can be seen today as one of the most amazing towns in the Cotswolds, but its reliable commercial success over the years, or indeed its historical social cohesion, are certainly not amongst them. On the contrary, as we have seen so many times in our travels, the reason this place is so breathtakingly beautiful is certainly partly down to its extremely checkered life. It sits in one of those classic Cotswold folds in the landscape, overlooking the vales, with steep access roads and an unforgiving terrain. If you are a regular listener, you will know that we've not really concentrated on ancient history at the Cotswold Explorer, although we have touched on enough for you to know that Bronze Age and Iron Age humans were fully aware of the brilliance of this area as a place to live and prosper. And Camden is no exception. Relics have been found here and are suitably cared for in the local museums. As to the Romans, it sits almost at the confluence of several main Roman roads: the Fosse Way, Icknield Street, now known as Buckle Street, and the White Way to Cirencester. The original Camden village was Broad Camden, about a mile from here, which was a tiny but important little settlement. Camden itself was built as a sort of new town in the late 12th century. The layout of the town is typical of the medieval planners, with a wide marketplace with long, narrow burgage plots on each side of the street, stretching back to lanes at the back. These days, these lanes are called Calf Lane and Back Ends. We're perhaps most familiar with this classic medieval layout from Burford, which is very similar. The market and 4-day fair at Camden was granted in the mid-13th century, and within just a few decades, Camden had become an extremely important centre for the collection, grading, and subsequent dispatch of wool to the market in Europe and elsewhere. Many of the buildings associated with the wool trade are still here. Most obviously, the Wool Staplers Hall, Greville House, built as a home for one of the most powerful and successful wool merchants in the country, William Greville, and of course the magnificent church, of which more later. The whole High Street is pretty much as it was during this time, unadulterated by modern alterations. The first of several major economic setbacks suffered by this community came with the decline and eventual banning of raw wool exports under Elizabeth I. Camden lacked the requisite water supply to transform its core business into the newly successful cloth trade, which switched mainly to the valleys around Stroud, where huge mills and weaving factories were set up in what is now called the Golden Valley. In the late 16th century, this town was revitalized by the arrival of the first of several individuals over the centuries with vision, influence and money, and who felt it essential to maintain this remarkable community. In 1609, Sir Baptist Hicks arrived in town. Hicks was a massively wealthy man who made a good deal of his fortune lending money to King James I. But he was a London mercer, a dealer in fabrics and silks, and an ancestor of the Earls of Gainsborough. He built the market building you now see in the centre of the market square, the remarkable almshouses on the hill up towards the church, and perhaps most importantly, he decided to build a huge manor house that befit his status, right next to the church itself. All evidence suggests that this house was truly magnificent. Built with local stone, with terraced gardens down to the valley, and boasting full running water on all floors, powered by the gravity from a substantial artificial lake at the top of the hill. Excess water was used to power the fountains in the garden. His arrival had hugely restored the morale and financial security of the town. The reason we talk about the house in the past tense, however, is that it didn't last very long. In January 1645, during the Civil War, and only 25 years after Hicks's death, the house was garrisoned by a royalist army under the command of Colonel Henry Bard, a good soldier, but a true specimen of the profane and rapacious cavalier, who had risen from the ranks and who, from his plundering excursions in the country round, had made the garrison almost equally detested by both parties. These forays, which extended even as far as Winchcombe, where the victims complained that they had not even a Sunday shift of clothes left them, went on till May. On the 7th of that month, the king, attended by his nephews Rupert and Maurice, set out on his march from Oxford to relieve the siege of Chester. On the 8th, he held a council at Stowe, where he spent the night, and on the 9th he passed within sight of Camden on his way over Broadway Hill. Rupert, meanwhile, ordered Bard to draw off his men and join the king's army. And, lest the enemy should make use of the house for garrison when he left it, he ordered Bard to set the place on fire before he marched off. Bard followed his instructions with his usual thoroughness, and as the king's army marched down Broadway Hill, they took their last look at the blazing ruins of the mansion. All that was left was the impressive gatehouse we see today, and the two banqueting houses, which give us a hint at the spectacular grandeur of the place. This wonderful gateway is a really good way of showing just how enormous the house of Hicks must have been. His influence here was extraordinary, despite the fact that the house itself lasted such a short time, because the almshouses and the market square and so forth are so influenced by his presence. He was a remarkable man, not exactly thanked for his royal support. But I do love this gate. It gives you the sense of scale of what used to be behind it. The Hicks family continued to be resident. Baptist's daughter Juliana lived in the courthouse, just round the corner from the gatehouse, an interesting building clad in stone but hiding a wood-framed building beneath. She maintained her family's interest in keeping the village in good condition. However, the disappearance of the main house rather took the gloss off this period of tranquility. War does have a tendency to do that. In the 18th century, a short spell of economic prosperity visited this town once more. The thriving silk ribbon business in Coventry encouraged peripheral silk businesses to establish themselves in local towns with suitable water power. A silk throwing business, that of making thread from the original raw material, was set up in Camden, which lasted until the fashion for ribbons passed and the business went the way of all things. Much of the town's present preservation and appearance is the result of two more recent events. In 1902, a Mr. C.R. Ashby moved his Guild of Handicrafts to Camden from the smoky depths of the early 20th century East End of London, bringing 70 guildsmen and their families to live here and setting up in the old silk mill. Although the project didn't last much more than 15-odd years, struggling to remain solvent, the effect on the town was considerable. Many houses were restored in appropriate style, and a few cottages were built with extreme care to make them fit into the existing architecture. Subsequently, the mantle was taken on by a highly successful and famous illustrator and etcher, Frederick L. Griggs, who came to Camden in 1904 and lived there until his death in 1938. He was the influence behind the founding of the Camden Society in 1924 and the subsequent Camden Trust in 1929. He restored several of the major houses in the town and designed a number of the wrought iron signs still to be found in the streets. Griggs is an important part of our lives. He illustrated the wonderful guide we've been following around the Cotswolds for the last 7 years, the highways and byways of Oxford and the Cotswolds. He was certainly responsible for fending off the frightening tendency during the first half of the 20th century to ruin medieval towns like Camden with monstrous so-called improvements. In 1911, he saved St. James's Church from some appalling restorations that threatened it. And a good thing too. This star of the numerous walled churches in the Cotswolds, known as such because of the huge financial contribution made to their construction by the merchants in this lucrative industry, is a building no one visiting the Cotswolds should miss. There is little, if anything, left of the original Norman church, but the great perpendicular west tower, built in 1500, is 120 feet high and a landmark for miles around. As with so many of the churches we have visited, the building has been a continuous process from the beginning. The addition of the aisles and south porch, the enlargement of the chancel, the rebuilding of the nave in the perpendicular style, all happened over the centuries from around 1260. The church is full of treasures, beautiful memorials, brasses, a pulpit and lectern probably made by the craftsman building Hicks's house and certainly donated by Hicks, whose own monument of marble is perhaps the most spectacular in the building. Just don't miss this place if you do come and visit. I hope you've enjoyed our lovely little spin round Chipping Campden. It is an extraordinary place. It's a real throwback. You can picture exactly what it must have been like in the days of medieval wool business. Leaving Chipping Campden, we're heading southeast, joining the Fosse Way, the Roman road, passing through Stow-on-the-Wold, another hugely popular Cotswold market town, heading for Bourton-on-the-Water, perhaps the most widely visited village in all the Cotswolds. Now, of course, Bourton is one of the most famous of all the Cotswold towns. It's very touristy. We're here early in the morning. And we're revisiting because last time we were here, there were one or two places we couldn't get into. And I think it was influenced somewhat by COVID. Come with us, I'm going to show you around. Bourton-on-the-Water has, for generations, been a star tourist attraction in the Cotswolds. Thousands of visitors crowd its high street every summer's day, enjoying the combination of Cotswold stone houses, grassy village green, touristy shops, and, of course, water. So let's just get the cliché out of the way. The Venice of the Cotswolds. It's a lazy description of this beautiful place, whose only real similarity with Venice is the fact that it has a canal running through it with some bridges over it. No one who's visited Venice would be likely to use this description, yet it is trotted out in too many guides of the Cotswolds. As with most of the villages of the Cotswolds, the village of Bourton has a remarkable and lengthy history, and some fascinating buildings, but it's quite difficult to write about the place in any way other than as a description of a holiday resort. The river Windrush runs through the middle of Bourton, wide and straight, and never more than about 10 inches deep. For the upper part of its course through the village, the river is slightly higher than the land on its right, and its comparative straightness also indicates that it doesn't follow its original line. The likely reason for the diversion was the use of the water to drive mills, of which there were 3 by the 12th century. It was reputed to be a fine trout stream as long ago as 1779. The village green along its length developed with the village itself, wide and grassy, the perfect picnic place in the summer months. I'm sitting down here because the very idea of the next story makes me feel tired. Every year there's a game played in this lovely stream. Because it's very shallow, it's easy to run around. But they have a kind of game of football. I think it's quite soon. We're going to try and find out the date. But it's a tradition rather like the Cotswold Olympics, which we've come across before, that goes back centuries. Goalposts are set up in the stream, and 2 local teams, under the desperate and often vain control of a referee, attempt to score as many goals against each other as possible. It's a wild game in which the soaking of the audience is as important a part as the football itself. J. Arthur Gibbs, in his incomparable book A Cotswold Village, describes, at the end of the 19th century, local cricket matches. He writes, "Some of the pleasantest matches we've ever taken part in have been those at Bourton on the Water." Owing to the very soft wicket which he found on arriving, this place was christened by a well-known cricketer as Bourton on the Bog. Indeed, it's often a case of Bourton under the water. But in spite of a soft pitch, there is great keenness and plenty of good-tempered rivalry about these matches. The MCC, or Premier Club, as the sporting press delight to call the famous institution at Lord's, generally get thoroughly beaten by the local club. For so small a place, they certainly put a wonderfully strong team into the field. On their own native bog, they are fairly invincible. Though we fancy on the hard-baked clay at Lord's, their bowlers would lose a little of their cunning. He goes on to say, "In the luncheon tent at Bourton there are usually more wasps than are ever seen gathered together in one place. If you're playing a match there, it is advisable to tuck your trousers into your socks when you sit down to luncheon." Like many of the Cotswold settlements, its location is no accident. Excavations of the Salmonsbury Camp, a gravel outcrop northwest of the village, give evidence of almost continuous habitation through the Neolithic period and the Bronze Age. Many coins and much Roman pottery have been recovered from Lansdowne at the western end of the village, and the coin evidence alone showing an occupation throughout the Roman period. Shortly after the Norman invasion, the church was established on its site at the northwest end of the village. This, and the discovery of pottery of the Norman period near the village centre, indicate that by the 12th century the village had at least begun to assume its orientation along the course of the Windrush River. It is possible that the building of houses there was connected with the diversion of the course of the river we've already mentioned. By 1773, the 2 parts of the village were connected by 4 bridges. The one opposite the green, narrow bridge had been built in 1756, and the one further downstream, Payne's Bridge, was rebuilt in 1776. All the bridges, including the later ones, have 3 arches, are slightly humped, and have very low parapets. The bridges now number 5. In the 19th century, it was already building a reputation for being an extremely picturesque village. In 1860, the stocks were removed from the green as part of an attempt to improve the appearance of the centre of the village. And in 1856, it was described as genteel and pretty. At the beginning of the 20th century, George Moore, a prolific local benefactor, was to a great extent responsible for planting new trees and mowing the grass to create the village green we see today. Opposite the village war memorial, he had a field gun placed. It was set in concrete to prevent a repetition of its being dragged into the river by a party of unsympathetic villagers, but after Moore's death in 1927, it was removed by general consent. In his will, Moore set up a trust fund for the maintenance of the green. Since Moore's time, the main change in the appearance of the green has been the alteration of many of the house fronts for commercial purposes, exactly the opposite of so many of the villages in the region. Moore's name is celebrated in the George Moore Community Clinic, opened in the village in 2013. Until the mid-19th century, nearly all the houses were built of stone, with Cotswold stone roofs. The roofs of Welsh slate, clay tiles or other materials on a few of the older buildings are mostly later changes. Even after the mid-19th century, builders usually imitated as closely as they could the traditional building materials. Nearly all the houses built after 1930 are of stone or reconstituted stone. Harrington House, the most imposing of the houses in the village, was built around 1740, incorporating as its northern wing a 17th century house. Built of yellowish ashlar in a regional Palladian style, the house is of 2 stories with the cornice and pediment carried by pilasters. The Cotswold stone roof is surmounted by a domed gazebo. Early in the 19th century, the house was bought by Mr. Hall, and by 1860 was owned by a Mr. Mills, who used part of the house as a brewery. Alfred Hadley, who continued to use it in the same way, bought it in 1870, and his family lived there until 1922, when it was bought by J. A. Fort, who added a southern wing in the same year, and from 1947 the house was used as a holiday fellowship hotel. It's an imposing and interesting house, and still an hotel. I'd be interested to hear from anyone who's stayed there. It looks as though it could be the perfect place to lay your head when visiting Bourton, but I'm afraid we have no way of knowing. The church, which, as we've already mentioned, was first built in the 11th century, is fascinating to visit. Dedicated to St. Lawrence, it was extensively rebuilt in 1793 by William Marshall, leaving only the chancel from the earlier building. It was again rebuilt in the 19th century, and the end result, with some later additions and alterations, is a fascinating building, well worth a visit. Even more recently, the inside has been adjusted and adapted, apparently to enable wider use than just Christian worship, and the result is a striking atmosphere with a welcoming feel. This won't be to everyone's taste, but it shows a very considerable determination to keep this great building relevant to the modern world and to use its great facilities for the benefit of the local community. There is very often a volunteer on site to guide you towards the treasures in this church and to give you a knowledgeable description of their history and importance. If you come to Bourton, by all means enjoy the plethora of shops and entertainment the High Street provides. Eat your picnic on the green in front of the rows of beautiful cottages and houses. Visit the extraordinary miniature village, a scaled-down copy of the village itself, built by proper builders with real building materials, and thus unlike almost any other of its kind. Say hello to the penguins, parrots, birds of prey, and a pond full of salmon at the Birdland Park and Gardens. Indulge your hidden petrol head by visiting the Cotswold Motoring Museum. Even take advantage of the miles of footpaths in the area for a stroll in the countryside. But don't go home without visiting the church. I hope you've enjoyed our little revisit to Bourton-on-the-Water. It is a stunning place. It's quite clear why so many hundreds of thousands of people come here every year. It's lovely, and this beautiful, peaceful stream that runs through it. We, of course, get the very best of it at this time of the day. Breaking off the Fosse Way and heading southeast again, we're off to the town of Burford. This was the first place Ross and I filmed when we started this journey all those years ago, and it has been a great pleasure to revisit this remarkable church and high street. Burford is not like a city set upon a hill, borrowing, of course, from Matthew 5, verse 14. It is not a place that forces itself upon the traveller's notice. Here and there, rising behind some projecting shoulder of the hills, he may catch sight of a grey church spire, dimly outlined, it may be, in the morning mists, and may say to himself, "That is Burford." But there is nothing else to reveal the whereabouts of the modest little town. He wrote that over 100 years ago, and very little has changed since. Its modesty has been both its trial and its saviour. There was an Anglo-Saxon settlement here, close to the river crossing or ford across the Windrush, and gathered around its church, almost certainly an Anglo-Saxon minster, where the wonderful church of St. John the Baptist now stands. But what makes Burford particularly special is the large number of surviving, or part-surviving, late medieval houses. Mostly of stone, but also with a surprising amount of timber framing. It would be a mistake to think that the village has remained unchanged for all that time. A great deal of maintenance, renewal, refurbishment and embellishment has taken place over the years, but the town's fluctuating fortunes has meant very little demolition and rebuilding. The result is one of the most perfect medieval high streets in existence. It won't surprise you to hear that its initial wealth was derived from the wool trade. Burford was one of the major raw wool markets in the Cotswolds, where sheep had been grazed in huge numbers since the arrival of the Normans. One of the very earliest merchants' guilds was established here in about 1100, and a weekly market was granted sometime between 1088 and 1107. In 1323, an annual fair was started and held once each year until 1497, when a second annual fair was granted. There was no lord of the manor, unusually, so Burford was released from the feudal system, giving the citizens special rights. The place was run by a guild consisting of an alderman and 10 burgesses, 2 of whom were elected annually as bailiffs. This highly satisfactory state of affairs lasted until 1862, when the lordship was purchased by Lawrence Tanfield, a notoriously tough landlord, whose wife was even more brutal than he, and who disbanded the corporation and removed many of the locals' rights. We've told the stories of the Tanfield family elsewhere, so we won't repeat them here, but suffice to say his ghost and that of his wife are supposed to have been captured in a bottle and sunk in the bottom of the Windrush River. Should the river dry up, legend has it that their spirits will be released to terrorize the town once more. An unlikely scenario if our weather is anything to go by. To generate such legends, you have to have made an impression. Tanfield bought and lived in the Priory, a spectacular building off to the west of the High Street, which has had an incredibly checkered career. It's been brought to the brink of collapse on several occasions, but always seems to find someone to heave it back from the abyss. The latest to do so is Matthew Freud, Britain's leading PR guru, who bought the place a few years ago and by all accounts has done a magnificent job of restoring it as far as possible, whilst making it habitable for a 21st century multimillionaire and his family. The medieval town planners knew very well what they were doing. They laid the town out in strips at right angles to the main street, with long plots stretching back to parallel lanes behind, giving each building lots of ground, as well as allowing for future expansion. They designed the high street to accommodate the market, wide and spacious from north to south, as well as west to make a separate livestock market. Halfway down the high street, on the left as you're coming down, on what is actually a crossroads, specifically staggered for a reason, which I'll tell you about in a second, is the Tollsy. It's a famous building. It was put up in order to house the people who ran the market and to take tolls from those people who wanted to come and sell their wares. Originally built in 1525, the Tollsy was a market house, approached up steps from the pavement and carried on rough octagonal stone piers, creating an open space for stalls and so on. The upper floor now houses the town museum, which I do highly recommend. It was here on the corner of Sheep Street that the market tolls were collected. The main east-west trunk road crossed the high street about halfway up, but was staggered by 20 yards or so to make it impossible for dishonest traders to avoid paying their market tolls by driving their flocks through at pace. Sheep Street goes west from the Tollsy. Witney Street goes east from roughly where I was standing a few seconds ago. The huge prosperity of Burford first came under threat as the market for raw wool diminished. By the time of Elizabeth I, raw wool exports were banned, and the cloth trade, along with leather and other peripheral sheep businesses, took over. Burford adapted with fulling mills and domestic leather manufacturing, particularly saddle making, at which they were the best in the country, and it took up the strain. But its big hit came when the main road I've described was diverted to what is now the A40 up on the ridge above the town. There are several old wool towns that suffered from the building of the A40. North Leach springs to mind as a town that has always found it difficult to adapt. Burford, however, has always shown an extraordinary ability to bend with the breeze. During the high days of the coaching business between London and the West Country, Burford lay on the route and at a perfect distance for resting the people and horses. Many hotels, inns and hostelries thrived. Many of them are still there, mostly still maintaining the ancient coaching inn feel. One hotel looks rather different from the others. In amongst this extraordinary medieval stone village, it's quite unusual to see a brick facade. The one behind me was put on just at the end of the great coaching boom, when there were so many hotels in the village that the owner wanted to make his stand out. So he put a brick fascia on the building. It's still here, and now it's one of the smartest hotels in town. It's called the Bull. Then the railway arrived, and once again bypassed Burford, leaving it to decline rapidly, and it really began to fall apart at the seams. Fortunately, the motorcar brought a huge new lease of life to the town, and it thrives to this day as a major tourist destination. There is also the huge business on the southern border of the town called the Burford Garden Company. In the best tradition of local entrepreneurs, the Johnson family started this amazing company in 1976, just when it was most needed, bringing huge employment to the area. as well as drawing customers from miles around to its extraordinary retail offering. It's so much more than a garden company now. I'm hoping to visit them soon and show you round this remarkably influential business. They are just the latest in a long line of inventive ways to keep the town thriving. And so to the wonderful church of St. John the Baptist. Evans writes of this church, "Little will prepare the traveller for the sight that awaits him when, after threading his way past Simon Wisdom's grammar school and Warwick's almshouses, he suddenly finds himself face to face with the imposing south facade of one of the largest and most splendid of the great churches of Oxfordshire. The massive Norman tower shows it must have been a church of more than ordinary rank from the first, but I suspect that it was originally a plain cruciform building, which many subsequent alterations and additions have transformed into the stately fabric which we now behold. It may be permissible to express a wish that the hand of the restorer had been stayed for another score of years, for it is upon record that the alterations going on under the name of restoration in 1876 roused the horror of William Morris and constituted one of the displays of unwisdom which immediately led him to found the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, or, in more familiar language, the Anti-Scrape Society. The church is also home to a slightly more gruesome story. At the end of the Civil War, at the beginning of the Republic, the new Republic, the people of England discovered to their horror that they'd got rid of a very autocratic and rather terrifying king and only replaced him with an equally autocratic and ghastly Republican government. And so there was some mutiny afoot. And there was a bunch of soldiers called the Levellers who travelled from quite a long way away through, oddly enough, Bampton, my hometown, and walked all the way to Burford to meet with their fellow mutineers in this town. The trouble is that the Republicans knew that this was going on, and they marched overnight and trapped them in this town and imprisoned them in this church here behind me. They were there for 2 nights and 2 days in very unsanitary and horrible conditions until they were marched up the staircase you see in the far left-hand corner of this church onto the flat roof, where they were forced to witness the execution of 3 of their ringleaders. But this sinister tale needn't distract you from the beauty of this church. It contains many treasures. Monuments to several of the members of the grand local families, the grandest of which is that to the Lord Chief Baron Tanfield, whom, as we've already said, the citizens of Burford had no reason to love. He lies here in his judicial ermine and collar of Essex, serious, dignified and composed. His wife, who paid for the monument, lies at his side. At the head kneels their daughter, the accomplished Elizabeth, Viscountess Falkland. At the foot, clad in armour, Lucius Carey, Elizabeth's illustrious son. The font is probably Norman, but was recut in the 14th century. The pulpit was made in 1872 using 15th century panels. Timber screens, an altar reredos, and magnificent stained glass in all directions. There is a great painting of the crucifixion over the tower arch, which sits amongst evidence on the walls of the architectural changes that have taken place in this building. As usual, the raising of the clerestory left marks of old roof lines. It looks very much as though the Sylvester Chapel was once a separate building and was brought into the body of the church by the removal of the outside south wall. The truth is that there are so many great things to see in this church that there isn't space here to tell you all about them. If you can, I strongly suggest you visit it. I really do hope you've enjoyed our revisit to this wonderful, wonderful town on this glorious, sunny summer's morning. We've had a fantastic time, and it's reminded us why we chose it as the very first time in the Cotswolds that we filmed, but also why so many hundreds of thousands of people come here every year to see this extraordinary little town. Leaving Burford, we're heading south to Bibury, well known for its trout farm and, of course, the nearby and spectacularly famous Arlington Row. We've come here early in the morning for obvious reasons. This place gets extremely busy during the day, but it is stunning. We're going to show you around. Come with me. Bibury has been subjected to the sort of hyperbole that, if you aren't careful, can lead you astray. I completely understand that over the last few years I've been guilty of over-enthusing about my much-loved Cotswolds, but the way people have spoken about Bibury is in a league of its own. There was, even until very recently, an image of Arlington Row, Bibury's beautiful little line of weavers' cottages, on the inside cover of the British passport, presumably so that English people could take with them when they ventured into dangerous foreign territory the comforting memory of what we've come to think of as the quintessential English village. Now, don't get me wrong, Bibury is beautiful, particularly at 5:30 on a summer's morning. But the most beautiful village in England, as William Morris had it in 1871, I'm really not sure. It's true that Alexander Pope and Jonathan Swift, that unlikely pair of 18th century satirists, travelling together to visit Lord Bathurst in August 1726, passed through Bibury, and also that Pope wrote that he would always associate the pleasing aspect of Bibury with his recent visit. But even 100 years later, in the late 19th century, Bibury was so remote that hardly anyone knew where it was. It was an isolated little place, just one of the string of little villages that bejewel the upper reaches of the incomparable Coal River with which Morris was so struck. Amusingly, searching for reference to the village, we discovered an Oxford guidebook written at the time which relates a story of an Oxford scholar more full of fun than money who proposed to a Bibury landlord — could it have been the Swan? Probably not — to teach him, for a silver crown, how to draw mild ale and strong beer from the same cask. The offer was accepted, and proceeding to the cellar, the scholar bored a hole in the full cask of ale and asked the landlord to stop it with his finger. Then, boring a hole where the strong beer was to run, the landlord was to stop that with his other hand. The wag then left, on the pretence of fetching some pegs, and mounting his horse, off he went, leaving the landlord a prisoner in his own cellar. The joke was certainly at the landlord's expense, but so many called to have a laugh that it turned at length in his favour by the increased demand. The moral of this probably apocryphal tale was, of course, that people who lived in places as incredibly remote as Bibury are naive, gullible, and ignorant. And so the myth began. It seems kind of surly when you're surrounded by such beauty to introduce a sour note. But 100 years ago, this river was one of the best trout fishing streams in the whole of the area. It was teeming with trout. I can't see a single fish now. There's a sort of slimy weed on the bottom of the river, which is a very bad sign. And I'm afraid that even the wonderful River Colne, which produces millions of gallons of water every single day, teeming down this valley, can't keep itself clean from the pollutants that mankind puts in it. It's a shame, but it doesn't spoil the beauty of this extraordinary village. What is seen today as Bibury is actually two villages combined. Bibury itself is a small settlement surrounding the Church of St Mary, with a line of cottages along the east bank of the river as far as the Swan pub. Over the bridge is the village of Arlington, with its stratospherically famous line of cottages now protected by the National Trust. And, in front, the water meadow known as Rack Isle. The central cottages in this row were probably built by Osney Abbey as a wool store as long ago as 1380. It seems likely that the conversion to cottages started in the 16th century, when the end cottages were built. So beautiful is this row that Henry Ford, when searching the Cotswolds for buildings to dismantle and ship to America, was extremely keen to take Arlington Row, and took some serious dissuading. These settlements are downstream from the villages of Colne St Dennis, Colne Rogers, Winson and Ablington, all of which we visited before, and a glance at our films will show you what the Bibury of Morris's day would have felt like, and perhaps help to explain his extremely enthusiastic report on the place. The river, as it enters Bibury, is fed by a hugely prolific spring which gushes from the hill beside the Swan Hotel. This lovely pub was probably built in 1800, only 30 years after the bridge itself was thrown across the river. Before that, all movement along the road westwards had to ford the river, and the water from the spring, so fresh and cold, caused problems for animals, both domestic and agricultural. The vast majority of the few people who came here will have come down the road from the north, through the aforementioned Colne villages, and it isn't hard to imagine how wonderful the aspect would have been as they emerged from the wooded lane from Ablington into the comparatively open vista of the village. Now, the main road east-west, over the bridge towards Cirencester, is busy, and of course compounded by the constant presence of visitors' cars along the stream. The spring created such a perfect environment for trout to breed in the River Colne that a trout farm was set up here in 1902. It's still here, and is now an amazing business, breeding unimaginable numbers of fish every year and selling in their terrific shop trout products of all kinds. They and their neighbours, the Swan Hotel, benefit most from the wondrous popularity of this little place. Another interesting reason for that popularity is that Emperor Hirohito of Japan, before he became emperor, spent time in England and stayed in Bibury, writing about it with the warmth and enthusiasm of Morris before him. It has become something of a pilgrimage for the Japanese people. Behind me is Bibury's very own lockup. If you were out on the town in the 18th century and you'd had a little bit too much to drink and you started to behave badly, this is where they'd throw you. It's amazing how many villages in this part of the world have one of these. Clearly it was a rowdy time. I wouldn't like to be locked up in there for very long. It has no window. The village of Bibury, at the southern end of the settlement, is centred round a lovely square of 17th and 18th century cottages, with a couple of substantial houses outlying it, one of which was the old vicarage. The church lies just south of the square and is delightful to visit. It's on the site of an important Saxon minster church, little of which remains, but there is an old Saxon gravestone set in the outside wall of the chancel, decorated with swirls, dots and faces, which is what is left of several, the others having been given to the British Museum in 1913. Reproductions of those donated can be found in the tomb recess in the south aisle. As is the way with so many churches in the region, it was altered and rebuilt in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, adding the tower and the aisles. Then again, the inevitable work, by no means always bad, I ought to say, by Waller and Son, late in the 19th century. The truth is that this church is a very complicated architectural puzzle and needs someone far more learned than I to go into it in detail. Suffice to say, it is a delight. A 13th century font, much restored, a lovely stone pulpit, probably 19th century, and a Scott-designed brass lectern all add to the experience, along with some rather wonderful Italian needlework pictures from the mid-1700s. If you stand in the church porch and look outwards over the river to the fields opposite, you can appreciate the extraordinary setting this church enjoys. The beauty of the tree-topped slopes opposite is a spiritual experience all of its own. Just south of the church, almost adjoining, is the splendid house of Bibury Court. This building is a very good example of the great advantage the fashionable enthusiasm for the Cotswolds brings. Just a few years ago, Bibury Court was an hotel, and fast deteriorating to a very worrying extent. Today, it is a spectacular private home, restored to its former glory in the best possible way. Originally a smaller house built and owned by William Westwood, it was sold in 1625 to Sir Thomas Sackville, who extended the house to create its current E-shaped form. His arms can still be seen above the porch. Subsequent owners altered the internal layout according to fashion, in the 18th century for the Castle family, the 19th century for the second Lord Sherborne, and the early 20th century for Sir Orme Clarke. In 1968, it was converted to an hotel with all the horror that entails. However, in 2015, it was rescued by the internationally renowned designer Mark Newson and his wife, fashion stylist Charlotte Stockdale. It is extremely difficult to imagine a more perfect pair to take on an important house like this. And whilst, sadly, none of us is likely to get a look at the final result for the moment, we can at least look down on this wonderful building from the hill above and be grateful that our descendants will get to see it as it is supposed to look for several generations hence. I hope you've enjoyed our little trip around this amazing place. It is wonderful at this time of the day, but of course it does get a little bit crowded later on. Finally, we're moving all the way south to Castle Combe. A favourite with filmmakers, the village has played host to many productions. In 1966, Dr. Dolittle was filmed in and around the village, and more recently, Stardust, The Wolfman and Warhorse used the classic soft colours of this remarkable place. And today you find Ross and me, without our dogs, in the wonderfully beautiful little village of Castle Combe. It's world famous, of course. It's nestled in this extraordinary combe-like bend of the hills, and it's a classic Cotswold village. We're here without our dogs because today is predicted to be the hottest day England has ever experienced, and I didn't want to bring them in the car. But we're going to show you around. It really is extraordinarily beautiful. We've come here very early in the morning, so there's practically nobody to join us, apart from the rooks in the trees. Come with me and we'll show you around. It's been a very long time since I set foot in the world-famous village of Castle Combe. In 1973, my lovely new wife and I decided to stay for a few days in the very grand hotel, which has for decades occupied the old manor house. My memories of the weekend are very fond. Returning is perhaps a little risky. We all know, as L.P. Hartley famously said, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. At first glance, the village doesn't disappoint. It has clearly been left alone by the ever-threatening developers and retains its romantic ancient feel. The hotel was welcoming to us when we asked to film in their garden, and we saw lots of apparently happy guests, and others sitting comfortably in the bar and sitting rooms. I clearly must bring my no longer new after 50 years, but even more lovely wife for another visit very soon. The modern fame of this village is down to having been used in 1967 as the location for a highly successful film starring Rex Harrison, Samantha Egger and Anthony Newley. It was called Dr. Dolittle. It's interesting for me that the draw of the village is still so enormous after all these years. It does make me wonder whether my own village of Bourton, the location for the village of Downton in Downton Abbey, will still be seeing tourism from all over the world 50 years from now. I'm afraid there will be some who rather hope not. There is a story, how apocryphal I'm not certain, that when the film company came here, they took down all the television aerials from the cottages' roofs, replacing them with a large communal relay tower on the top of the hill, providing the residents with very much enhanced television reception. Certainly there isn't an aerial to be seen in Castle Combe. In fact, signs of the 21st century seem entirely absent, which has helped a lot to preserve its credentials as a great film location. Many filmmakers and program makers have taken advantage of this over the years. On the surface, this would seem to be a great bonus for the village, but I know from personal experience that it's a double-edged sword. In Castle Combe, this conflict was clearly demonstrated to your intrepid Cotswold explorers. We wandered into the church just after it was unlocked in the morning to film its treasures for your benefit, and the lady volunteer cleaning the building was very clearly not pleased to see us. Her view, with which I do have some sympathy, was that if we had come to film her church, then we should ask permission and pay substantial sums for the privilege. I did try to convince Ross that being recognized as a professional cameraman was flattering. It seems it was his tripod that gave him away, and to convince the local lady that, in view of the nature of our enterprise, the £5 I'd already popped in the collection box was all I could reasonably afford. But her resentment was much more than personal to us. She was fed to the back teeth with visitors disturbing her home village. Whichever way you look at this problem, there's no getting around the fact that tourism and the way it disrupts life in these beautiful places is not a universal benefit. As it happens, this village only exists because of human conflict. In 1135, when King Henry I died, despite his very best efforts, his succession was highly disputed. Henry was the son of William the Conqueror, so the processes and traditions were very far from established. The great barons and nobles of England had sworn to support Henry's daughter Matilda in her claim to the throne. Henry, it seemed, had set his daughter up to move smoothly into the role of England's first reigning queen. The trouble was that once Henry was dead, the barons changed their minds, thinking instead that it was a step too far to allow a woman to rule the nation. They decided that Theobald, Count of Blois in northern France, would suit their interests best, as well as bringing the French principalities of Normandy and Blois into alignment with England. But as Theobald arrived triumphantly in Rouen on his way to England, confident of his support, he was shocked to discover that his younger brother Stephen had dashed ahead to London where he had already been crowned king. Really, these young upstart siblings really are the limit. The time of uncertainty that resulted from this conflict amongst siblings and cousins resulted in a prolonged civil war in England, sometimes referred to as the Anarchy. Matilda and her supporters occupied the southwest of the country. Yorkshire, East Anglia and London was the territory of Stephen. The Cotswolds became the front line of the conflict, and castles and forts were thrown up all over the place. Castle Combe was one of them. There's hardly anything left of it now, so don't come here expecting a castle, despite the village's name. But the importance of this settlement is a direct result of that fortification. The church dedicated to St. Andrew is well worth a visit, despite its ferocious custodian. Originally founded in the 13th century, the nave was added in the 14th, with the tower following in the 16th century. The church was substantially rebuilt in 1850-51. A slightly disconcerting extension was built in 2018 to provide modern conveniences. On the north side of the church is a superb carved stone monument of a Norman knight, Sir Walter de Dunstanville, Baron of Castle Combe, who died in 1270. In the window above the tomb is the coat of arms of the Scroop family, lords of the manor for almost 500 years. The tower was started in 1434 with money from local wool merchants. It has a beautiful fan-vaulted ceiling. And in the base of the tower is one of the oldest working faceless medieval clocks in the country. Speaking as I am in January 2023, the news is full of the antics of Harry, Duke of Sussex. It's hard not to make comparisons with the past. Our monarchy has been fought over for centuries by people who believe their claim to the throne to be better than their close relations. Remember Richard the Lionheart, who only had to leave the country for a year or two for his brother John to try and take over? Anyone who's touched on the legend of Robin Hood will remember that. As we discovered when we filmed at Blenheim Palace, the great Elizabeth was imprisoned by her older sister Queen Mary on suspicion of conspiring to take the throne. It is thought, quite widely, that she was fortunate to survive to take over when her sister died. I do hope you've enjoyed our grand adventure across the brightest stars of the Cotswolds. Off the back of this, I'm thrilled to announce our brand new website, which is now a comprehensive guide to the Cotswolds, an index for every single one of our films, of which there are now well over 100. You can also visit our shop, where a Cotswold Stars collection is now available, to celebrate the launch of this film. Simply visit the link in the description or check out the tagged products below. To catch our upcoming series about great country homes in the Cotswolds, as well as more exploration of hidden gems, be sure to subscribe to the channel and press the bell icon to receive notifications. We'll see you very soon somewhere else in the Cotswolds.